Geppetto, the man who became a puppet. Once upon a time in a small village in Italy, there lived a kindly old woodcarver named Geppetto. Though he lived humbly, he brought joy to the village children by carving elaborate wooden puppets for them to play with. Yet despite his generosity, Geppetto felt lonely living alone with no family. In hopes of remedying this, Geppetto carved a puppet boy out of smooth pine wood. He painted the puppet's cheeks rosy red, dotted bright blue eyes, and stitched a patchwork tunic. As a finishing touch, he placed a yellow feathered hat atop the puppet's head. Smiling down at his creation, Geppetto named him Pinocchio. That night, as Geppetto slept, the benevolent blue fairy quietly fluttered into his workshop. She tapped Pinocchio with her sapphire wand, magically transforming him into a real human boy. When Geppetto awoke the next morning, he could hardly believe his eyes as Pinocchio walked and talked before him. Geppetto embraced his new son, overjoyed at his dream coming true. Geppetto and Pinocchio quickly formed a close bond. Pinocchio helped Geppetto around the workshop while Geppetto taught Pinocchio woodcarving skills. Their cozy cottage was filled with laughter and love. But one night, their happiness came to an abrupt end. You see, the tricky red fairy had watched from afar, jealous of the blue fairy's powers and the happy life she had gifted Geppetto. As Geppetto and Pinocchio slept, the red fairy sneaked into the cottage, a cruel prank in mind. She waved her crimson wand over the slumbering Geppetto, casting a wicked spell to turn him from man into puppet. Hearing the red fairy's mischievous cackle, Pinocchio emerged from his bedroom just in time to see Geppetto transformed before his eyes. Geppetto's limbs froze in place, his skin hardened to wood, and his mouth became a carved grimace. Frozen in shock and fear, all Pinocchio could do was watch helplessly from his hiding spot. After the red fairy vanished into the night, Pinocchio raced to Geppetto's side. He shook Geppetto's stiff shoulders and shouted desperately in his wooden ear, but it was no use. The poor boy wept over his father's motionless body, thinking him trapped forever in this mute, paralyzed puppet form. When morning sunlight crept through the cottage window, Pinocchio prayed it had all been a terrible nightmare. But his hopes sank when he saw Geppetto remained a stiff wooden puppet. Pinocchio knew then the spell was horribly real. Though heartbroken, Pinocchio refused to give up on his poor father. He decided he would embark that very day on a perilous journey to find the blue fairy. Surely she would take pity and lift this cruel curse to return Geppetto to human form. After making Geppetto as comfortable as he could near the fireplace, Pinocchio packed a small satchel with bread and cheese. He then set off into the forest beyond the village to begin his quest. Many weary days passed as Pinocchio trekked through the gnarled woods and misty bogs. He faced raging rivers, rickety rope bridges, and snowy mountain passes in his pursuit of the magical island where the blue fairy was rumored to live. When tracks would disappear or paths run cold, Pinocchio wanted to collapse in despair. But he found strength remembering his poor father trapped helplessly in a body of wood and paint back home. He knew he must keep going, no matter the danger. For Geppetto's sake, he could not fail. Back in the village, Geppetto slowly realized he could wiggle his limbs ever so slightly and make muffled grunting sounds despite his frozen puppet face. Over several days, he painstakingly dragged himself from the fireplace to the front door, intent on finding Pinocchio. But upon stepping outside and attempting to walk on his rigid wooden legs, Geppetto lost his balance and tumbled down the front steps. Sprawled on the ground, it took all his effort just to sit up. Seeing townspeople passing by, Geppetto tried waving his stiff arms and crying out, but the townsfolk only stared in confusion and horror at the living puppet. One bright sunny day, Geppetto managed to hobble to the village market on unsteady legs. He awkwardly attempted to mime his plight, hoping someone might understand and help locate Pinocchio. But the vendors and shoppers just backed away uneasily from the mute, jerky puppet. Before Geppetto could find any answers, dark rain clouds suddenly rolled across the sky. The downpour soaked Geppetto's wooden joints, causing them to swell painfully. He could barely limp home as the rain continued relentlessly. By nightfall, Geppetto collapsed back inside the cottage, his whole body frozen stiff and aching. For days he lay helpless, terrified his son would never find him in this state to lift the vicious curse. Loneliness and despair overwhelmed Geppetto as he regretted taking his human abilities for granted. Nearly 2 weeks later, just when Geppetto thought he could endure no more, he heard voices outside the cottage. Thinking Pinocchio may have returned, he dragged himself towards the door. But instead of his son, 2 sinister-looking men appeared. They realized at once that Geppetto was no ordinary puppet but somehow alive. "He'll make a fine new marionette for our show," one rasped to the other. Before Geppetto could react, the villainous puppeteers grabbed him. Though Geppetto tried to resist, his wooden limbs were useless against their strength. The men took Geppetto to their caravan wagon and forced him into a jester costume. Despite Geppetto's silent pleas, they tied strings to his arms and legs and made him dance and caper for their amusement. There was nothing poor Geppetto could do as their helpless puppet slave. His insides churned with rage and shame. Late that night, after the puppet masters drank themselves into a stupor, Geppetto was finally able to loosen their clumsy knots. His fingers shaking with adrenaline, he unwound the last strings from his wrists and ankles. Free at last, Geppetto leapt off the stage and fled into the deserted midnight streets. He ran on wobbly wooden legs until the village was far behind, collapsing in a meadow as the sun peeked over the horizon. Geppetto knew he had to find his way back to the cottage before Pinocchio returned. Using the sun's position, Geppetto oriented himself towards home. He wandered for days, hiding from people and struggling to maneuver his stiff puppet body across the terrain. One afternoon, Geppetto limped out of a thicket to find himself on a high cliff overlooking the sea. The shore far below seemed familiar, though the cliff path was precarious. Intent on getting home, Geppetto slowly made his way down the steep trail, clutching branches to keep from tumbling. He was nearly to the bottom when his wooden foot hit a patch of loose pebbles. Geppetto lost his balance and fell hard, unable to stop himself. He tumbled down the rocky cliff, hitting the sand below with a thud that cracked his left leg clean off. Waves crashed around him as Geppetto stared in dismay at his detached limb, unable to walk or crawl. As he sat stranded on the tide line, Geppetto despaired that he was doomed either to erode away in the sea or left crippled if he did make it home somehow. Just then, he heard a friendly chuffing sound. An intelligent dolphin was gazing at Geppetto curiously. Taking the end of Geppetto's leg gently in its mouth, the dolphin nudged and pushed Geppetto far up the beach to safety. Geppetto wished he could properly thank his new friend as the dolphin swam swiftly out of sight. Although battered and exhausted, Geppetto realized how close he was now to the village port. If he could find even a makeshift crutch, he just might make it back home after all. Geppetto searched the beach until he found a suitable branch to brace against his leg stump. Securing it with strands of seaweed, Geppetto cautiously stood up. Though wobbly, he found he could hobble slowly forward without falling. It was terribly awkward and painful, yet Geppetto shuffled onward, his cottage was so near. By great fortune, a merchant ship had just finished unloading goods at the dock. Under cover of night, Geppetto limped up the gangplank unseen and wedged himself among the cargo barrels. There he stayed as the ship embarked the next morning bound for Geppetto's village. The voyage was long and miserable in the cramped, dark hold. Geppetto had nothing but thoughts of Pinocchio to sustain him. He prayed his son was all right and that their reunion would come before he collapsed entirely. At long last, the ship sailed up the familiar coastline and port came into view. Once docked, as soon as the crew had disembarked for the tavern, Geppetto dragged himself out from his hiding place and down the ramp. Few villagers were about in the chilly night air. Using his branch crutch, Geppetto hobbled the last half-mile to the cottage unnoticed. Geppetto had just reached the front steps when the cottage door burst open. Pinocchio came running out, shock and joy on his face. "Father, it worked," he cried. A sparkling blue light swirled around Geppetto. He felt his cracked wooden leg fuse back together, his frozen face soften into a smile. Geppetto was human once more. Overcome with emotion, Geppetto embraced his son, laughing and weeping with relief. Pinocchio excitedly recounted how he had finally found the blue fairy and convinced her to restore Geppetto when he returned home. Although still weak, Geppetto insisted they have a feast to celebrate. As they dined on bread, cheese, and sweet wine late into the night, Geppetto told Pinocchio of his trials and tribulations as a mute, immobilized puppet in need of his dear son's help. The two made a pact to always support each other and appreciate life's gifts. From then on, Geppetto cherished every ordinary human ability now that he knew what it was to live without them. And he never forgot the important lessons learned on his harrowing journey as a puppet in search of the cure, that true humanity and love can overcome even the most powerful magic spells. The end. We hope you have enjoyed this different take on the classic story of Pinocchio. Please let us know what you think in the comment section. Thank you and have a wonderful day.